This morning, the Washington Post released a bombshell report called the Afghanistan Papers, based on the transcripts and the notes from a series of interviews conducted by the Inspector General's office. The Washington Post acquired over 2,000 pages of documents that came from interviews from over 400 of the highest level officials involved in the Afghanistan war, from its conception back during the Bush administration all the way through the end of the Obama administration. So we're talking about generals and colonels and admirals and people from the State Department and national security advisors in the White House. There were even documents from Donald Rumsfeld, the former Secretary of Defense. And the recurring theme throughout these documents and these interviews is that for the entire duration of the Afghanistan war, 18 years now, the longest war in U.S. history, the government, the people in the military, the White House and the president, in two different administrations, now into three with Donald Trump, have been lying brazenly and intentionally to the American people every step of the way about this war so that we can continue to stay in this war apparently indefinitely. Now, if you've been listening to the show for a while, if you follow U.S. foreign policy closely, if you consider yourself part of the anti-war, anti-interventionist movement, a lot of these things we already knew. We knew that every step of the way the government was lying about what was happening in Afghanistan. So was expected, not to downplay its importance, but it was expected. Now, what I consider the most important takeaway of these Afghanistan papers isn't necessarily what we learned about the war, but it's that the only people in the country who are advocating for us staying in this war, they have all been exposed as being on the record saying, yeah, I have no idea why we're there. It's been a total debacle since we've been there, unmitigated disaster, and we've been lying to the American people every step of the way so we can stay in this war longer. So with that damning admission, you have the only people in the country, one of the only groups of people in the country advocating for this war or advocating for us to stay in this war, admitting that we shouldn't be there. So if we lived in a sane world, this will change the dynamics of the Afghanistan war completely. Because the very last poll that was conducted said that about 85-90% of the country did not want to be in Afghanistan. The people who are advocating us staying there, the generals and the people in the State Department, the people in the White House, also admit we shouldn't be there. So that should be the end of the discussion, right? So we're all going to pack up shop and we're all going to leave Afghanistan because we admit that we lost the war. And there was no winning this war because it was always going to be an endless war. If there was a legitimately anti-war party in this country, they would capitalize on this and say, okay, I'm going to introduce legislation to end this Afghanistan war since we're all basically in agreement that this has been bullshit and it's an utter debacle. But that's not going to happen. Even though everyone's conceding that we shouldn't be in this war, this is a glaring admission that it's not the citizens or the voters of the United States who run U.S. foreign policy. It's not the president of the United States who runs foreign policy. It's not Congress, and it's not the military. Because all of them are in agreement that we shouldn't be in Afghanistan, apparently, or that it's an utter debacle. So who does that leave as the main driving force for us still being in Afghanistan? The military-industrial complex, the war machine, the defense contractors making billions of dollars off of this conflict. It's because they have thoroughly bought both parties in this country and the overwhelming majority of politicians that, despite the fact that even the politicians know this war is bullshit, the military knows this war is bullshit, and the American people know this war is bullshit, and so does the president. Just because all the politicians are bought by the people, the only people profiting off of this war, because of that simple fact, we're going to stay there indefinitely and fight this endless war. That is a damning indictment of our political system and our foreign policy establishment in the United States, because they are entirely subservient to the military-industrial complex. Now let's get into some of the details and quotes from this article. I want to start with one of my favorite quotes from this article. Quote, "Every data point was altered to present the best picture possible." This is from an Army colonel who served as senior counterinsurgency advisor to U.S. military commanders in 2013 to 2014. Again, high-ranking military official in the war in Afghanistan, admitting, yeah, all the data, all the numbers that the U.S. military and the State Department and the White House put out about Afghanistan, all of it was lied. We manipulated all of it. So that right there confirms that all leftists and non-interventionists and anti-war people are 100% correct to be incredibly skeptical about everything that comes from the U.S. military and the national security apparatus, including the intelligence agencies and the State Department and the White House. Because it's amazing, because that's the most reasonable, logical position you could take when it comes to the U.S. national security apparatus. Don't believe a word that they say, even if they provide data, because they're just going to flat out lie and make up fucking numbers. So it's the most reasonable position to be incredibly skeptical or downright not believe the U.S. military when it comes to war. But still, the people who voice that opinion of skepticism and criticism of the U.S. military, and those people are smeared relentlessly throughout society, every corner you can think of, in academia, in, of course, the mainstream media. A lot of the times when people voice anti-war positions or that they're incredibly skeptical of the military, they get smeared as being anti-patriotic and hating the troops and all that stuff. But this right here proves, just this one quote alone, not even mentioning the rest of this bombshell article and report, that one quote alone from this army colonel who was in leadership in Afghanistan proves, yes, you're 100% right to not believe the government, or even when we provide numbers, because we're just going to lie about that shit. So the next point I want to make is, are other people who have blindly and uncritically just taken what the military and the national security apparatus says at face value, are those people now going to come out and say, damn, we were so wrong, we shouldn't have believed them, and we're sorry for smearing all the people who are critical of them from the beginning? Are they going to say that? Are all these dumbasses on CNN who just blindly take these anonymous sources from the military, take quotes from these anonymous sources in the military, are they going to admit, oh shit, they duped us, they had us, we should have been verifying these numbers for ourselves, we should have been paying more scrutiny, and we should have been more critical to these claims from the government? No, they're not going to admit that. They're still going to do the same exact thing in Afghanistan, and they're going to do it in every other war. The U.S. military or some official in the U.S. government comes out, tells them this is what happened, and just like the loyal lapdogs and stenographers that they are, the mainstream media is just going to repeat it uncritically. This isn't going to change a goddamn thing, even though people in the military throughout this entire report are saying, you shouldn't believe us because we'll just lie about shit. We'll just flat out lie about the most important thing, one of the most important topics we could even talk about. We will lie about war and death and destruction, and we'll just flat out manipulate the numbers so they back up whatever we're trying to make. Here's another amazing quote about how much of a fucking money pit the war in Afghanistan was. This is directly from the article. One unnamed executive with the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, guessed that 90% of what they spent was overkill. This is an executive at USAID, one of the top people, saying, yeah, 90% of what they spent was overkill. Quote, we lost objectivity, we were given money, told to spend it, and we did, without reason. Without reason. They were just given piles of cash to burn, blank checks, and nobody asked any questions. Nobody said, hey, do we need all this money? Do we need to be spending this money in Afghanistan? Are we spending it correctly? No. Congress and the White House gave them piles and piles of cash to fund this endless war, and they took the money and they spent it. So again, this goes back to what progressives and social democrats have been saying for a very long time. When it comes to issues like endless war or providing welfare to multi-billion and multi-million-dollar corporations, endless checks, don't ask me about how we're going to pay for it. There'll be piles and piles and piles and piles of cash, and we'll fund this till the end of time, no questions asked. If you want to talk about funding social programs, funding food stamps, funding Social Security, funding free college, or funding Medicare for all single payer healthcare system, the first thing that members of the establishment, the mainstream media, establishment Democrats and Republicans, the first thing that they will say isn't, oh shit, you know what? We do have a healthcare crisis in the United States. 40,000 people die every year because they can't afford basic healthcare. 500,000 people go bankrupt every year because they can't afford to pay their medical bills. We have a fucking healthcare crisis in the United States, and it is entirely borne about through greed and corruption and capitalism run amok. Everything is up for sale when it comes to the United States healthcare industry. So when people mention, hey, maybe we should have single payer healthcare, their first response isn't that. It isn't, oh yeah, you're right, that would actually help the most people and it would be the most effective and it would cost less. That's not what they say. The first thing they say is, how are we going to pay for it? Compare that to this quote. 90% of what they spent in Afghanistan was overkill. Quote, we lost objectivity. We were given money, told to spend it, and we did without reason. Where are the deficit hawks? Huh? Where are the fiscal conservatives? Huh? Have not a goddamn word to say when the money goes to the war machine and it goes to the military industrial complex, when it goes to funding endless wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, anywhere you can think of. If it's an endless war, it gets a blank check. If it's a social program meant to help people, meant to improve the lives of people, not just fucking murder them and drop bombs on them, we have the first question, not the second, not the third, not the fourth. The very first thing they say is, how are we going to pay for it? And in the article, they did something that I really liked. They put some quotes from President Bush and President Obama about what they were actually saying in public about the Afghanistan war, even though behind the scenes they knew what the deal was and they were lying about it anyway. This is Barack Obama's old lying ass back in December 1st, 2009, talking about the Afghanistan war. Quote, the days of providing a blank check are over. Yeah, It must be clear that the Afghans will have to take responsibility for their security and that America has no interest in fighting an endless war in Afghanistan, said Barack Obama before he became the first U.S. president in history to spend two full terms fighting a war. Barack Obama just lying through his fucking teeth, talking about we're not writing any more blank checks or we're not fighting an endless war in Afghanistan, before he did both those things. And before he took those blank checks and wrote them for some wars in other countries, some other illegal wars like in Syria and in Yemen. So again, Barack Obama, a fucking liar, a fraud, a tool of the establishment and the military industrial complex and the war machine. So we spent over $1 trillion in Afghanistan. Nobody's actually sure exactly how much we spent, which brings me to one of my other favorite quotes in this article. Quote, this is from the article. The U.S. government has not carried out a comprehensive accounting of how much has been spent on the war in Afghanistan, but the costs are staggering. So minimum $1 trillion we spent in Afghanistan. Nobody knows exactly because apparently it wasn't important enough for anybody to come up with the exact figures on this. Again, endless war, blank check. You want to help people? How you going to pay for it? That's the first question. Everybody wants to know exactly how much each tax bracket is going to be paying under Medicare for all. Everybody wants to know how much corporations are going to be paying under Medicare for all. Is there going to be a deficit? Is it to the federal budget? Everybody wants to know all these specifics. How are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? Afghanistan, Iraq, oh shit, nobody actually really was just writing checks and printing money. I didn't know we were keeping track here. I thought we were just doing this shit. Shows you everybody's priorities in Washington, D.C. Now, let's talk about the human toll of this war, the human cost. So, the war started back in 2001. 157,000 people. Let me repeat that. 157,000 people dead in Afghanistan because of this war. This, and of course, has nothing to do with, does not even touch on the 1 million dead civilians. 1 million dead civilians in Iraq because of that illegal war right next door. But let's stick to Afghanistan here. So let's start with the largest number. Afghan security forces, 64,124. These are the people who were aligned with the U.S. military in their war against Al-Qaeda and Taliban and whoever else they were fighting in Afghanistan. 64,000 of them dead for a war with no end goal and no objective. And now let's talk about the other large number, the Afghan civilians who the U.S. military is willing to say, yeah, they're just civilians. 43,074 dead women and children and elderly people in Afghanistan because of this endless war. These numbers are fucking staggering. Here's a controversial one. The Taliban fighters and insurgents, 42,100. Here's why I say it's controversial. No way in hell do I believe all those people were actually insurgents or Taliban fighters or the bad guys, how we want to describe them. Because in the Afghanistan war logs that Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange released back in the early 2000s, they explained the criteria that the U.S. military has for classifying enemy combatants. And it's fucking absurd. Any male over the age of 17 or 18, I believe, all the way up to the age of 65, if they're killed by the U.S. military in a drone strike, in an airstrike, or in a raid, whatever it is, if they're killed, by default, their default status is an enemy combatant simply because their age and the fact that they're male. Has nothing to do with you. You don't have to prove that they were taking up arms or that they were attacking U.S. troops or anything like that. Just simply the fact that they were males of a certain age by default classifies them as enemy combatants. And this was one of the ways that they would fuck with the numbers, and they would quote alter every data point, numbers that were coming out of Afghanistan to make them look better. So I don't even know exactly how many of these people who are being classified as insurgents and enemy combatants were actually that. Many of them could have just been innocent civilians who just happened to be men. And then the rest of them, yeah, there were some people who became radicalized to pick up arms and join the Taliban and other radical groups or other groups in Afghanistan because of what they saw we were doing there. Because they saw us massacring their family and other civilians in Afghanistan. Because they saw us occupying their country, a lot of these people, their only choice was to join the Taliban and other groups fighting against the United States because they have to defend their country. As bad as they think the Taliban is, or as bad as they think Al-Qaeda is, the U.S. is worse because we're illegally occupying their country and massacring civilians unrepentantly. 3,814 U.S. contractors dead, 2,300 U.S. military personnel dead, 1,145 NATO and coalition troops dead, 424 humanitarian aid workers dead, and 67 journalists. All those lives lost in vain for a war that did not need to happen and is completely pointless and aimless and could have ended years ago and arguably should not even started to begin with. All those lives lost for no reason. And it's hard for people to really come to grips and wrap their minds around just how much death and destruction that is. All those families whose lives are never going to be the same. All those people who had dreams and ambitions and who had goals and who had plans to do whatever they wanted with their life. 157,000 of them dead. For what? For the profit of the military industrial complex. This is fucking gross. And I just find it amazing that knowing all of that, knowing how much we've spent, how much money could have been spent here improving the lives of U.S. citizens instead, knowing how much lives were lost, so many people were murdered and slaughtered, innocent people. There was just a story last week about a woman who just gave birth in Afghanistan, leaving the hospital with her child. Her car struck with a U.S. drone strike, killed her and a baby and 5 other civilians around the hospital. I'm sure it was more than that, but that's just the numbers that the U.S. military is reporting. As we know, that's bullshit. So knowing all that, and they all still lied. They still went out and lied to the American people in press conferences. Barack Obama went and took his lying ass in front of the American people and told them he was going to end the war and told them that he was going to write blank checks for this war in Afghanistan or blank checks for wars around the world. And they lied and they did it anyway. Knowing the cost, knowing how many people died over this. This is fucking gross. And so I have to ask, last point I want to make is there going to be any accountability about this? Are the Democrats who have held this fucking nonstop 25-8, this dog and pony show when it comes to investigating Trump, whether it's for this bullshit Russiagate scandal or whether it was for this bullshit Ukrainegate scandal? Donald Trump made a phone call and he asked for unethical favors. all the time they spent investigating that, are they going to devote even a fraction of that time to investigating the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and the Trump administration for lying to continue the longest war in U.S. history, killing thousands of civilians, killing thousands of U.S. troops and U.S. contract workers, spending trillions of dollars on corruption and propping up the military-industrial complex? Will there be any congressional investigations about this? This warrants investigations the size of Watergate and the size of the 9/11 Commission and many other historic congressional panels that have been convened. This merits that type of investigation, but they're not going to do that. Even though all these officials went and lied under oath, committed perjury to Congress, I don't even know how many times. Are they going to investigate it? Nope, because once you're part of the military, once you're lying on behalf of the establishment, it's fine. You get a pass. You're committing war crimes if you're doing it on the behest of the military-industrial complex and the war machine. That's fine. You can lie to Congress, you can lie to American people, and it's just fine. So many takeaways from this. Of course, democratic institutions in the United States in decline, if they even exist anymore. Congress isn't going to hold the executive branch accountable for this. Not at all. And the wars are going to continue unabated, even though we should end them now.